it has come to my attention that a part of the Blue Lock community has Itoshi Sae on Fraud Watch. This is just something I had to touch on. Let's break it down. From the start of the series, we know that Sae was playing on the team Real, which is based on the real life team Real Madrid, the noted strongest club in the world, which he was scouted for at age 13. But due to regulations, he wasn't able to play on the top team and return to Japan. This is due to how Spain's club teams have a regulation that forbids foreign minors from signing pro contracts, although he is actually only in Japan due to his passport expiring. On top of being the strongest club in the world, this club also sent a 320 million offer to Kaiser, whose goal was to crush Bastard München by getting an offer from another big club. This very club satisfied him to the point he thought he already busted through this barrier. On top of being scouted by the strongest club in the world and playing for them for 4 years, we also know he was chosen as one of PIFA's best new 11 players, sought after by club teams all over the world. Furthermore, once he remains in Japan to see what type of striker Japan can produce via the Blue Lock program, while also playing alongside the U20 team against Blue Lock, with the condition being that he gets to choose one striker from the Blue Lock program, that being Ryusei Shido. Sae being such a player that he's able to control Shido's ego and destructive playstyle, Shido being such a player that it isn't really him plus his team versus the other team, it's him versus everybody in the field, and he's just playing for the sake of his own goals. Now, it's actually made clear to us that in the U20 game, Sae isn't really trying for most of the game. He could have scored 3 times before the initial goal made against Blue Lock and doesn't really take the game seriously. Only until after Barrow scores, making it 3-3, does he note that he's raising the game level, and only idiots who can keep up will get to see what happens next, his numerical aura showing. It's explained to us that Sae's gear change is a step above challenge-based concentration, or the flow state, which characters like Isagi can tap into on command in the NEL, or have figured out a formula to tap into that. And what Rin is chasing is beyond that. A big point of discussion that is thrown around is that Sae wasn't sweating until the last goal against Rin, where we see one sweat drop on his face. Now, normally I wouldn't fully be into characters sweating as a gauge to how good they are, but this actually does have some relevance on the general discussion, since in the second Ego is Bible, which is kind of like the guidebook for Blue Lock, manga author Muneyuki Kanishiro actually makes some notes about the Blue Lock vs U20 game. This is how the conversation follows. In the flow where Aiku enters flow after Shido is good, right? By the way, on the U20 Japan representative side, Aiku and Sendo are drenched in sweat, but Sae isn't sweating at all. Kanishiro directly notes both Blue Lock and the U20 Japan representative teams are getting heated and clashing with all their might. And finally, Sae starts getting serious at the end, and the sibling rivalry with Rin begins. I don't think this is anything to run home about, since we don't know how serious he was. It just says he was starting to get serious. I also think that this is likely in reference to chapter 139, where Isagi directly notes Sae is now getting serious. Like, I think that's what is being referenced here. I don't think Sae being serious and dominating Blue Lock really equates to him going full throttle to the extent that he's being pressured or exerting himself heavily, but it would be above his flow state since he does manually enter the gear change. So I'm not going to start basing characters off if they're sweating or not fully, as I think that's kind of just a flawed metric, and we should more so be basing this off feats. But on the other hand, I do think you can derive certain conclusions from it depending on how much the character is exerting themselves. For example, none of the masters during the NEL are really sweating or exerting themselves to that extent, but at the same time they're only playing for 3 minutes. So I think a lot of these are case by case, but generally we should stick to the feats and actual abilities of the characters rather than trying to scale them strictly through arbitrary means. A good comparison, if you're going to take this like one sweat drop seriously before I stop talking about it, is that Snuffy, when playing against Noel Noah, also did have one sweat drop as well, yet that was mainly off Noel Noah, and we don't really see the sweat afterwards or any indication that he was exerting himself. I think it's kind of a similar thing here. This is all to say, I think the sweat metric can work in some instances, but I think in Sae's case, it really isn't an objective measure for him going all out or just being forced to exert himself, in a similar manner to how the Masters, despite the fact they only played for a short time, also weren't exerting themselves to an insane extent despite the fact that they were playing against other pros. Dialing this back to the discussion at hand, Rin notes post-game that he beat Sae in that moment by getting him to do the step that he's best at and barely managed to stop him. So Rin was able to stop Sae because he forced him to pull a move off that Rin had prior knowledge of. Rin wasn't actually overwhelming Sae before that point. So I think this is just a mix of Rin having prior knowledge of Sae's technique while also being an absolute animal in his flow state. This is all relevant tangentially to the NEL, since Rin post U20 game has improved a lot as a player. He's noted to have increased his kicking arsenal, so he has more goal options than before, and Rin does know he's leveled up up to make it this far, but that was nothing more than his techniques. Different translations also note that he just became stronger, but only from a technique standpoint. So it's likely that Rin hasn't actually clipped himself physically from the U20 game and has mainly been focusing on technique, since it's not like everybody in the NEL had the exact same training. This is relevant since there's characters that just compete against Rin in his flow state, who is again an absolute animal. The undisputed 1v1 striker in Blue Lock, with Kaiser noting that in terms of individual skill, Rin is just the most exceptional. Keep in mind his goal made Loki, who hadn't played a single game in the NEL up to that point, hop into the game. The most important thing I want people to realize or keep in mind right now is that the narrative presented in the series is that Sae at this moment in time is still the wall that Rin has to overcome in this series, meaning that until Rin actually surpasses Sae as a player, Sae will still be considered greater, or should be. Basically, the better Rin is, the better Sae is going to be, as he'll just upscale from all of Rin's feats. When you also consider that Rin was technically training in the sense that he was told to focus on his ego, he would be an improved variation than the version of himself that ended the NEL, to the point that Ego notes you're no longer who you were 2 weeks ago. And on top of this, the Japan team also has 30 days before the tournament where the final training starts before the World Cup, meaning on top of the 44 days of improvement that Rin would have undergone, he will also have multiple matches to improve before he actually plays alongside Sae. This actually coincides perfectly with what Rin says post U20 game, where he notes directly that if he can control his focus / murderous intent, those destructive impulses, he's certain he could beat Asagi and Sae, with his flow state improving or him understanding his ego more in the NEL, to the point that he actually has to overcome a phantom of Sae to evolve or break through the barrier that he's currently faced with. This is all to say there is a lot more time for these characters to get stronger, and the fact that Sae is the narrative wall for Rin should kind of tell you that he probably hasn't been eclipsed yet, and we shouldn't take one droplet of sweat as a definitive point that Sae is just Rin level from the U20 game, especially since Rin in his destroyer mode is absolutely insane. And coupled with the fact that it's unlikely, or we don't really have definitive proof that he's like a completely different character or player physically than he was during the U20 game, when the series tells us it's mainly techniques that Rin was improving in, which makes sense as Rin was already a very complete player throughout all of Blue Lock, so him not needing to up his physicals makes quite a bit of sense. So should Sae be on Fraud Watch? Absolutely not. He's just way too ridiculous at this point in the story. This is not even talking about his potential metavision or him having a variation of metavision that enables him to make ridiculous passes, like Charles, for example. There's all these unknowns about him that we just really shouldn't make any conclusions based off of it, especially when, again, the narrative is that he's kind of this big wall for Rin to overcome later in the series. That's the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, consider liking, subscribing, all that good stuff. If you like Blue Lock content, definitely stick around. I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.